Hello and welcome back. We will start with module 5 today. Module 5 will deal with word acquisition, as in how the infant starting from slightly before 1 year, age of 1 year onward, how do they start to produce words, not just sounds, but words, and what is the level of production and what is the level of comprehension and how they compare, and also when they are trying to say, when they are trying to speak in words, what are the kind of constraints, what are the kind of difficulties they might be facing, and based on that the various kinds of theories. So, all of these are part of this module. So, this is a sort of a roadmap in very brief as to what is to be expected in this module. So, I have organized them lecture wise. Lecture 1, that is today's lecture, will have a brief overview about how the transition from the phonological word form to the word, as in a vocabulary item, how the journey looks like, that is what we will be talking about. So, phonological word form to word meaning mapping. So, by the time we talk about speaking in words, we mean that there is an entity, there is a unit of language which also has a meaning, it is not just a sound. So, that is the journey we will talk about, and of course, word comprehension. In the next lecture, lecture 2 we will talk about reference problem and extension problem. Lecture 3 will talk about theories of innate linguistic bias and then non-linguistic factors and syntactic bootstrapping, and the last lecture will talk about emergent coalition model. So, basically this entire module will look at the various kinds of models, theories and assumptions and constraints that are talked about in terms of language acquisition at word level, how the word level language acquisition happens in infants. Now, the phonological word form to the word meaning mapping, as in when the when we actually are talking in words, when we mean something. So, this is a stage where children are growing, children are no more in the phonological acquisition, we are talking about very small children like few months, starting with few days, and then we moved on to few months and kind of map the trajectory. Today, we will talk about kids who are slightly older, because by the time they start producing words, they are older, they are around 1 year and more. So, that is the stage of life we will be focusing on. So, so far what we have seen is that infants may learn words by separating the speech stream using various kinds of phonological information. If you recall, we were talking about the rhyming, the stress pattern and so on, as to how by activating the phonological information which is embedded in the words, in the sentences, in the speech stream, so to say, how children might be able to segment the stream. So, these were based on this is in the domain of phonology, based on sounds and their various properties, speech, stress and so on. So, these are the things that we have already talked about. So, today together they are all called phonological bootstrapping, because starting from phonology, starting from the sound system of the language, children are expected to create some sort of an understanding through which they can segment the continuous speech, segment into some units, which we later call the words. So, at that level when they are segmenting, it is called a word form, not a word, but a word form. So, the resultant understanding is that of a phonological word form, basically meaning some sounds coming together to form some kind of a unit. That is what children have achieved at that level. Now, knowing a word would usually mean these three things: sound, form of the word, as in how the word sounds, then its denotation, as in what does it denote, what does it refer to, what does it mean, that is the second thing, and third of course, is the syntactic properties. So, for example, a word like table sounds like the whatever it sounds like is what we use with we use IPA for. In dictionaries, if we are looking up words, the IPA form tells us how it sounds. So, table, not all the alphabets that we write are not there in the speech form, because they are not individually uttered. That is how the sound is. Now, the denotation is that a thing that looks somewhat like that has a flat surface with 4 legs and 3 legs or whatever, that kind of a thing. Now, the syntactic properties of it. What does it mean, syntactic properties? There are couple of things. First and foremost, it has to first tell you whether it is a noun or it is a verb, adjective, adverb and so on and so forth. Each of these traditionally called parts of speech, each of them have a syntactic property. For example, if the table is a noun or whatever noun we are talking about, a noun can have two primary positions. One can be the subject, the other can be the object, the agent and the patient role. So, what kind of a role the word in that particular sentence is performing, what kind of a role does it have. So, these are the three things that are fundamental to understanding word or to produce word for that matter. So, word, when we say word, this is what we mean, these are the three parts of a word that exists. But infants till 12 months may not really know this part, they not really know what word means for adults or for slightly older children as well. So, all the denotations of the words they do not know, nor do they have any idea at that stage, of course, till 12 months about the syntactic properties. So, basically what they have is the word form. Thus, they are said to understand word forms, only word forms, which is the phonological word form. For example, we have of course seen quite a few examples in the phonology section, where we looked at how effectively children can segment fluent speech, segment units from the fluent speech. Today, we will look up some more references, some more works in this vein, so that you understand the continuity from understanding the word form to words, meaningful words. So, we have already seen that infants who are familiarized on a set of words can identify the same in the test phase. So, you are familiarizing them on individual words, and when they hear it in phrases or in passages, they do identify them. So, in one such study, the infants were first familiarized with novel pairs of words like cup, feet and so on. In the test phase, they could identify them in the context of a passage. So, this is just to refresh your previous knowledge that we have already discussed. So, this kind of findings primarily point out that the emergent word knowledge that is there at that particular stage. This is a continuously developing phase of life when development is rather rapid. So, this is a stage where the emergent word knowledge is happening, that is the time we are talking about. When they are not yet exposed to word meaning pair in a regular frequency in the environment, it is not always that every word has a referent ready that we point out to them or so on. All the speech that they hear around them may not always have the referent readily available. So, that is what we mean by that less frequency or low frequency of the word meaning pair in the environment. Some words of course are like toys or whatever the children are surrounded with. Another word that is very high frequent is the word mummy. So, these words of course, they show recognition at a very early stage like 6 months of age, but other things more less frequent words which are more in number they will not be yet exposed to the word meaning pair. So, by 7.5 months they can generalize across speech changes for such familiar words. Now, this part is important, generalizing across speech patterns, across speech changes. So, for example, I think we did discuss this before, that the same word uttered by different people will have a different acoustic signature. Not only that, the same person uttering the word in different kinds of scenarios, different times may also have different pitch or different kinds of some slight differences in acoustic signatures are possible. So, the children try to figure out or they are capable of figuring out the invariance within this entire possibilities, set of possibilities, that even in spite of the slight pitch difference, slight difference here and there, this is the same word. That understanding, that generalizing capacity starts to develop by 7.5 months of age. Now, Even though there are a lot of proof that supports this view, there are also some studies that have pointed out that this fine tuning also has some issues. For example, infants are not always capable of finding out the words in some kind of in the continuous stream. For example, when do they fail? They typically the problems that they face typically has to do with these three types of problems. For example, change of emotion, the same word said in different kinds of emotions. So, in a flat tone versus an angry tone versus a sad happy tone or something. So, change of emotion of the same word might make it difficult for children to understand. Gender of the speaker, the same word spoken by a man versus a woman might pose some challenges, and then fundamental frequency. Even though we understand that children are capable of understanding a lot of acoustic cues, but fundamental frequency, when they are manipulated, it has been found out that they do not always identify the words very well. So, this is probably because one of the reasons put forward is that they are not able to understand the interaction between change of sound and change of meaning. Now, this is very important. On the one hand, they need to understand that the same word may have different pitch, slightly different other acoustic properties, but it still is the same word. At the same time, slight changes may also take them to minimal pairs, for example. Right. So, pen versus pan versus fan, for example. So, there is also a slight difference happening in the first sound. So, there is this sort of a limitation that children typically are faced with. So, other early limitations are also there, like infants are only able to segment words that conform to the predominant stress pattern of their language. We have seen that very young children can identify languages with their own stress pattern. So, it is syllabic type or the Moraic type or whichever type they are able to. But when the stress pattern remains the same, they find it easy, but when the stress pattern changes, they find it difficult. So, if you give the same word by altering the stress pattern, they might find it difficult, as we will see in some examples. Another point that has been put forward is about the frequency. Is frequency an important variable? What does this mean? The children's ability to distinguish words and non-words might be because they are familiar with the words from their experience. The surrounding, the kind of words that they are growing up listening to might be a reason why they are able to distinguish some words from non-words, because non-words are not something that you use, nobody uses that. So, that is probably one reason. So, one important study in this regard, they used head turning preferential procedure, which we discussed before, and this was on 11 and 12-month old infants. What they did was, they showed the infants words that were high frequent, that is more common words like baby bottle, biberon, this was on French children, as opposed to some other words which were less common. And of course, they showed the infants listened to longer to the words that are more likely to be frequent. So, you know that the kind of words that the parents typically use with children, the list of words that children have more in common in the environment, and so on. So, that is what they found out as well. The words that were more common in the environment were more readily recognized. This work was also extended by others to determine the degree to which infants retain the phonological detail of the word forms they know. So, what aspect of the word form? So, word form we have talked about stress pattern, we have talked about the other acoustic, the rhyming and so on and so forth. So, which aspects do they retain when they are trying to understand? So, in this case, in this study, the stimuli were divided into three types: familiar words, unfamiliar words and altered familiar words. So, familiar words fine, non-familiar, that is unknown words, and what they did was some familiar words were altered by changing the syllable initial consonant to another wrong with another wrong consonant. So, there were three kinds of words that they used. For example, tummy is a very common word for children. So, this is very familiar, and this word when you juxtapose this to a word like tenor, tenor is a very less frequent word in a child's environment. commonly, in most households this is not used very often. So, tummy is familiar, tenor is unfamiliar. Now, the third category they created by changing the first sound, the initial sound with another wrong sound. So, for example, one word was sami. So, tummy replace the ta sound, replace it with sa sound, it becomes a sound like sami, which is not a word, it is a non-word. That non-word sounds maximally to a familiar word. These were the three categories. So, the hypothesis was, what they were trying to find out is that tummy is more likely to be familiar, and hence this will be more readily understood, more readily recognized. Similarly, if sami is not recognized as familiar, no preference between sami and an unfamiliar word is expected, because sami is as unfamiliar as the unfamiliar word, because sami is not a word. So, it is not, it will be in the category of a non-word even if it sounds like a familiar word. So, that is the manipulation they did with the stimuli. What did they find out? Very interesting findings. First, the infants could recognize words with deviant forms. So, deviant is the sami for tummy and sami. So, sami was a deviant form and infants could recognize them. However, when the alterations occurred in unstressed syllables, which is the second syllable. In English, remember we talked about that in English it is the strong weak pattern. So, the first syllable gets the strong stress followed by the weak stress, and like that it goes. However, when the deviance happened, when the change happened in the unstressed syllable, they were able to understand, they were able to recognize the word, but infants did not recognize words consistently when the word stressed syllables were uttered. So, if you have altered the, if you have changed the word tummy to sami, but changed the stress to the word final position, then they could recognize, but not when the stress was in the typical position, which is the first syllable. Second finding was, when unstressed syllables were altered, infants' preference for deviant forms over unfamiliar words tended to appear only on later trials. So, there is a degree. The familiar trials, familiar words were recognized fastest, they were of course known words. Within the unfamiliar types, there were two. One was the altered, the deviant form, and the other was actually unfamiliar, but real words. Now, there they wanted to figure out if there is a difference between the deviant words and the unfamiliar normal words. What they found out was, sometimes the deviant forms, when compared to unfamiliar words, the preference for the deviant forms only built up towards the later trial. So, in the initial stages the differences were less. As the child grew more familiar with the experiment, then there was a preference that was visible. This suggests that although deviant forms were recognizable in some cases, they took longer to recognize them, because if they were they were looking at the stress pattern and whatever, then it took them some time. Thus, the overall findings suggested that infants do accurately retain the phonological features of the onset consonants in at least some of the cases, some of the words, because that is what appears to be the cue on the basis of which they understood. Though mispronunciation does not bar recognition altogether, because they also did, they also found the deviant words, they could recognize the deviant words. There were many other studies that have followed on the basis of this kind of finding. Rather well known study on Dutch learning 11-month-old showed infant knowledge of both syllable initial and syllable final consonants in monosyllabic words. In the previous study, we looked at the syllable initial stress pattern having being an important indicator. In the other study, which is in 2005, they found out that both in syllable initial as well as syllable final consonants that had an impact. Another study which is quite striking, because it negates all the other findings. So, what they found was that 9-month-olds did not show preference for canonically produced familiar words over unfamiliar words, canonically produced as in the normal words. So, table talked about in table pronounced as table rather than sable. So, but then they did not find any preference for the canonical pronunciation over the unfamiliar one, which is a very interesting finding, and hence I have added it here. But this kind of findings are rare, they are very less. So, by 11 months infants seem to overcome these limitations and are able to recognize words independent of their surface forms. Right. So, they are able to segment words that exemplify both predominant and uncommon stress patterns. So, it is not only the stress pattern that governs my language, but also even if the same word appears in a twisted stress pattern, they will be still able to find out, they will be able to understand. Now, children can learn, so how does the, what is the trajectory? One of the idea is that the familiarization aids in form and meaning mapping. So, once you get used to the word more and more, and then you cross domain mapping you can do, and then eventually you will understand what the word means. So, children can learn a word form first phonetically accurately, and then add meaningful content to this form as the situation allows. As the child is more exposed to higher number of scenarios where they see the same word being used for the same referent over and over again, then the mapping gets kind of solidified in their mind. So, this was shown by a number of studies where familiarization seemed to be an important predictor for infants learning words and their meaning. So, a couple of them I have added here, the most important findings. So, therefore, the period between 7, so we have already seen 7.5 months, then 10 to 11 months and so on. So, 7 months to 11 months is a very crucial time that reflects a series of transition in how word forms are represented in memory. So, word forms defined as phonological units that are later associated with the lexical entries. During this period, infants become aware of the repetition of words in different contexts, as I had just mentioned. Now, this in turn helps them map. So, in other words, they become aware about the recurrence of words as a lexically equivalent unit. Over and over, different situation, different people, but the same unit are getting produced again and again, and they always refer to the same kind of a it maps onto the same referent. Then they realize that this is a word and that this is the meaning of the word. Now, so from word form representation, so this is how it gets represented in their mind. Now, it is not exactly clear how this transition happens, how word form to complete word really happens. However, there are of course many theories. Now, there are a few of them have added there, that this is probably the trajectory with through which they understand. Some few factors that are identified and have been proved through various studies, that that is what I have added here. So, frequency in the input, which we talked about before. So, depending on the number of words, the kind of words that are frequent in the environment, that they will learn first, and eventually they will be able to map that word on the meaning, on the denotation faster. That is one. Pre-exposure to word forms prior to a word learning task. Often what happens is, when in the experiments, children are put through a familiarization phase. So, that kind of a pre-exposure also does help. Inclusion of word units, word like units in bearing frames, and the inclusion of the prosodic undulation associated with infant directed speech. So, these are the some of the factors that have been put forward. Now, while the child is busy mapping between forms and meanings, and forms that also changes its form slightly across speakers and scenarios and so on, there are two things that happen at the same time: generality and specificity at the same time. Generality basically refers to that they need to generalize across situation, across people, across various whether it is emotional aspect of it, or the the page, the gender and so on. So, memories for words have to be sufficiently broad to incorporate the rampant variability in natural discourse, and to normalize for accent, different voice, emotion and other factors. So, they need to understand that across all of these factors, this particular thing remains invariant, this particular signature, acoustic signature remains invariant, and the meaning also remains the same. That is on the one part. But on the other hand, memories have to be sufficiently specific to not incorrectly equate minimal pairs or tolerate mispronunciation. Now, this is the problem, this is the dilemma that the child probably faces. So, there are these slight changes across speaker and across situation, but also the slight changes might lead you to a minimal pair. I talked about pan and fan earlier. So, how does the child create the balance is what is a very interesting problem to be solved. Therefore, the learners have to negotiate tension between generality and specificity of representation in a way that allows their phonological definition of a word to correspond precisely to a semantic definition, right. So, all of this basically means where do they draw a boundary, where does the phonological difference, the acoustic signatures cease to remain the same word and turns into a different word. That tussle they have to overcome. Now, the last part of a word structure is the phonological form, then the meaning, and now we are talking about grammatical structure. Now, words are not just meaning bearing unit, but they are also the raw material that grammar manipulates. So, once you have got the words, we then use those words in different positions, create sentences, and then we can change the sentences from a simple assertive sentence to an interrogative sentence and so on. So, that is the manipulation that grammar allows. That is what the child also has to figure out if they know, really know a word. This is what they have to be aware of as well. So, lexical and grammatical acquisition are often found to be fundamentally intertwined. However, the nature of this complex relationship is not yet very fully well known, it is still debated. There are lots of studies. The older studies which depended on diary entries, diary studies, which are famously called diary studies, the time when the experimental paradigms were still not in practice. From those days, the reports came that the first 40 to 50 words learned by children, majority of them belong to the noun class. Then they learn the nouns first, followed by the other word classes. So, and within nouns also, these are the kinds of nouns that they learn in the initial stages. So, people, objects, toys, vehicles, body parts and animals, which is understandable because they play with toy animals, they play with other kinds of toys. They are also taught body parts, ears and all of that. So, eyes and ears and hands and legs, there are all those rhymes. So, these are the things that they learn first. So, the first 40 to 50 words are typically made up of majorly of nouns. Now, one of the most well known studies from this time is on a boy named Ted, 11-month-old boy. His progress was tracked for over a period of 8 months, starting when he was 11 months, and his vocabulary of 43 words had 31 nouns. So, that is an example of the predominance of nouns in an infant's vocabulary when he is starting to speak in words. However, children differ in terms of their tendency of utterances. Not all children start to speak very neatly in nouns and verbs and adjectives like that. Some children also speak in terms of chunks, memorize chunks which they mispronounce. So, for example, what that for what is that, all gone for all gone and so on. So, there are those two kinds of patterns that typically children follow. Some learn neat and neatly learned words, some of them learn in phrases. So, that from there we come to the theory of types of learning that was put forward by O'Grady in 2005. The first kind of learning he calls this analytic. Analytic, so basically what happens, children break down the speech stream into small parts and focus on learning individual words, and that is when they learn a number of nouns and also on. So, they usually produce more nouns. Children who use this learning strategy produce short and clearly articulated one word utterances. Remember, this is not a either or kind of a scenario. Children might follow a mixture of both, but it is a predominance that we are talking about. It is not like some children speak only in nouns, the others use only phrases, not like that. They have a predominance. So, some children have a predominant nature of using predominant type of learning, which is the analytic type. So, they tend to produce more nouns, more focused single words which are typically nouns. So, parent speech is considered important in this case, especially if they use what is this kind of a game. This kind of game is very common, that is that parents play with children. They, in fact, they are trying to indirectly teach children the names of various objects. That is how the noun acquisition actually happens in a very typical setup. So, what is this? This is a toy. What is that? That is a ball. What is that? That's a tree, something like this. So, when this kind of a word play is very common in this kind of game is very common in the households, when parents indulge more in this, then the idea is that children tend to learn more words in terms of words. The other kind of learning is called the gestalt learning, where children who favor this pattern, they usually memorize and produce large chunks of speech, usually a phrase. So, bye bye and various kinds of such things. So, this is also called expressive, as word production in this case would focus more on activities or relations. So, bye bye, then going out, something, some of these kind of thing, no more, ate, are some common expressions favored by children in this case. Of course, they will not get the pronunciation correct in the beginning, but eventually they learn. So, this is the other kind of type of learning. Then there is another idea of fast mapping. Fast mapping is not exactly a theory, this is an observation that children, irrespective of their type of learning, the type of learning technique that they prefer, children are generally rather fast in learning new words, very fast. So, that this rapid learning of words for this our purpose, here it means mapping of the sound form, the word form on the denotation, on the referent, on the meaning. That is what we call fast mapping, mapping of words on the sound, on the meaning. So, in one particular study, the 3 and 4-year-old children were asked to bring a hexagon, not a triangle. So, there were hexagons and triangles all there, and they were the instruction was bring me a hexagon, not a triangle. These children already knew what a triangle is. So, they knew that not a triangle means the only other thing that is there in the environment must be hexagon, even if they had never heard of the word hexagon, nor had they seen it, but they could still bring the referent correctly. So, that is what we mean by fast mapping. So, both the word and the object were novel for the children, but they could immediately map. There is this chromium experiment as well, we will see. So, now children are at a juncture where they need to map word form to meaning as well as figure out their grammatical property. Children now will need to navigate a number of issues before they finally get to it. Now, these issues are one of the two of the most important issues in this are called reference problem and the extension problem, which is what we will take up in the next lecture. So, this is where we complete the first part of module 5. Eventually, in the next lecture we will talk about the two different problems of the of this mapping. Thank you.